Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Appalachian Trail has always been built on trust. Strangers share shelters, split their last granola bar, and look out for each other on the mountain. That culture of openness saved my life more times than I can count. But it also made us all sitting ducks for Randall Lee Smith. I was section hiking through Virginia in 2008 when I heard about the shooting near Damascus. 2 guys fishing by the trail, one dead, one barely alive after fighting off his attacker with a rock. What made my blood run cold wasn't just the violence, it was learning that the same man had done this before, 27 years earlier to the day, at the exact same shelter where I'd spent a night just weeks before. Smith killed Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey at Wapiti Shelter in 1981, shot them in their sleeping bags with a .22, then tried to burn the bodies. Got caught, served 15 years, and walked free in 1996. The system thought he was rehabilitated. The mountains knew better. For 12 years, Smith lived quietly in the same area where he'd committed murder. Then, on May 6, 2008, the anniversary of his first kills, he struck again. Same weapon, same method, same cold calculation. Scott Johnston died instantly. Shaw Farmer survived by beating Smith with a rock and escaping to get help. The manhunt that followed revealed Smith had been preparing for years. Weapons caches hidden throughout the mountains, maps marking isolated campsites. He'd turned the trail into his personal hunting ground, and we were the prey. What haunts me isn't just what Smith did. It's how he did it. He looked like any other hiker. Talked like one too. The trail culture that makes us family also made us vulnerable. Every friendly face at a shelter now carries a shadow of doubt. Every trail name could hide a killer. Smith died during that final manhunt, but his legacy lives on in the wariness that now defines trail culture. We still help each other, still share our food and stories. But we also carry pepper spray and check in more often. The innocence is gone, replaced by the hard knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who looks just like us. Grandfather Mountain has a permanent resident, and he's been hiking the same trails since 1902. I guide climbers up the technical routes, so I know every inch of that mountain. I also know there's something up there that doesn't belong to our time. The first time I saw him, I thought he was just another hiker in vintage gear, the type who insists on using canvas packs and leather boots for the authentic experience. He was standing where the profile trail narrows along the ridge, wearing heavy wool despite the summer heat. His pack looked like military surplus from World War I, and those boots, thick leather with metal eyelets, belonged in a museum. When I called out a greeting, he tipped his hat politely and mentioned something about checking the rope chimney for loose rock. Problem is, nobody's called that route by that name in 70 years. I watched him consult what looked like hand-drawn maps, talking about trail conditions and climbing routes that matched the mountain's geography perfectly. Except they were routes from the early 1900s, before modern trail systems existed. When I tried to get closer, he simply faded into the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Local historian Margaret Whitfield spent years collecting similar accounts. She traced the phantom back to Thomas McReynolds, a mountaineer from Boone who vanished in October 1902 while attempting to establish a new route up the mountain's eastern face. They found his base camp, his supplies, his detailed maps, but never found him. The sightings have continued for over a century. Always the same description. Middle-aged man with a thick beard, wool clothing, canvas pack, those distinctive metal eyelet boots. Rangers have found old-style campsites in remote areas, stone fire rings and lean-to shelters built in the primitive style of the early 1900s. Fresh ashes, recently cut wood, signs someone's been using them, but no living person is ever found. In 1987, a group of professional climbing guides spent 20 minutes talking with him about techniques and equipment. His knowledge was encyclopedic but frozen in time around 1902. He seemed confused by modern gear and trail markers, describing landmarks that had been destroyed decades ago by erosion and development. When they tried to photograph him, he began to fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. What makes the phantom hiker different from other ghost stories is his sense of purpose. He's not trapped by trauma or reliving his death. He's still trying to complete his mission, mapping every trail, climbing every peak, finding that perfect route to the summit that eluded him in life. Some loves are too strong for death to break. Thomas McReynolds loved Grandfather Mountain so much that he's still exploring it, still searching, still climbing, more than a century after his body returned to the earth. In Robertson County, Tennessee, there's a death certificate that lists the cause of death as supernatural. The year was 1820, and the killer was known as the Bell Witch. This wasn't folklore or legend. This was a documented case witnessed by hundreds of people, including future President Andrew Jackson. The Bell Witch tormented the Bell family for 4 years, speaking in a clear female voice, physically attacking family members, and demonstrating knowledge of events happening throughout the county. John Bell was the primary target. The entity cursed him in language so vile it shocked frontier settlers, claimed to know his deepest secrets, and promised it wouldn't rest until he was dead and buried. For 4 years, Bell's health deteriorated under the supernatural assault. Unexplained seizures, a swollen tongue that made speaking difficult, a gradual wasting away that doctors couldn't explain. The climax came in December 1820. Bell was found dead in his bed, and family members discovered a small vial of dark liquid in his room. When they asked the Bell Witch about it, the entity gleefully confessed to poisoning him. To prove its claim, the witch told them to give drops of the liquid to the family cat. The cat went into convulsions and died within minutes. The witch then celebrated, singing and laughing throughout the house as the family mourned. When officials filled out Bell's death certificate, they faced an unprecedented situation. Multiple credible witnesses had heard a supernatural entity confess to murder and demonstrate the method used. After extensive investigation, Tennessee officials made an extraordinary decision. They listed the cause of death as supernatural, specifically attributed to the Bell Witch. For the first time in American history, a state government formally acknowledged that death could come from sources beyond the natural world. The death certificate still exists in Tennessee archives, a permanent reminder that sometimes the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond becomes thin enough for even governments to acknowledge forces beyond human understanding. Dudleytown, Connecticut, carries a curse that stretches back 500 years to the execution of Edmund Dudley in 1510. When the axe fell on Tower Hill, legend says his blood carried a supernatural condemnation that would follow his descendants wherever they fled. The curse wasn't just folklore. Generation after generation of Dudleys met violent deaths. Edmund's son John executed for treason, his grandson Guilford beheaded alongside Lady Jane Grey. By the early 1700s, surviving family members fled to America, hoping an ocean might break the chain of tragedy. They settled in a remote Connecticut valley and founded Dudleytown in the 1740s. For a brief time, it seemed the curse might be broken. Families built homes, cleared fields, established a community. Children were born, crops harvested. Peace seemed possible, but the curse had followed them across the Atlantic. Within a decade, residents began experiencing spells of madness, sudden episodes of rage, depression, or terror that left victims confused and disoriented. Shadowy figures were seen watching from the tree line. Livestock died under mysterious circumstances. Children began disappearing, one by one, over months and years. The town's founding families fell to inexplicable tragedies. Abiel Dudley found dead with no signs of violence or illness. His wife Sarah met a similar fate 3 months later. Gideon Hollister lost his entire family to a plague that affected no other settlements, then was found wandering naked and mad through the woods. Nathaniel Cornwall kept detailed journals of his family's experience in the 1790s. He described voices calling from the forest that sounded like dead relatives, strange symbols carved in trees that seemed to multiply when he wasn't looking, and waking up at the edge of cliffs with no memory of how he got there. Even his determination couldn't withstand the supernatural assault, and he abandoned his property rather than risk his family's lives. By the early 1800s, Dudleytown was dead. Houses stood empty, crops rotted in abandoned fields, and the community that had been built as a refuge from an ancient curse became its greatest monument. Modern investigations are hampered by private ownership and strict access restrictions. Those who have gained authorized entry report equipment failures, temperature drops, and electromagnetic anomalies centered on locations where the town's tragedies occurred. Genealogists tracing Dudley descendants have found patterns of tragedy, mental illness, and premature death that continue to this day. Edmund Dudley's curse has proven remarkably persistent, surviving transportation across an ocean, the passage of centuries, and the complete destruction of the community it targeted. Some forms of evil, it seems, are truly eternal. The stone marker on Bluff Mountain tells a heartbreaking story. Ottie Cline Powell, aged 4 years, 11 months, 15 days, lost on Bluff Mountain, November 9th, 1891. But for over a century, people have reported that little Ottie never stopped looking for home. He was the youngest student at Flat Top School, known for his independence and curiosity. On that November afternoon, he asked to step outside and simply vanished into the vast wilderness. What began as a family search became one of the largest rescue operations in regional history. Hundreds of volunteers, professional hunters, bloodhounds from Richmond, all searching for one small boy. They found evidence he'd survived for days. A makeshift shelter of leaves and branches, fragments of his clothing, and most heartbreaking of all, his small handprint pressed into mud near a rocky overhang, reaching upward as if trying to climb to safety. But they never found Ottie himself. Within a year, hunters began reporting sightings of a small figure in the same area, always alone, always searching, moving in deliberate patterns as if conducting his own methodical hunt for something or someone. Unlike a normal lost child, this figure didn't cry for help or seek assistance from adults. It seemed to be continuing the search that had begun on that November day in 1891. The most credible modern encounter occurred in 1967. A team of experienced hikers saw what they thought was a lost child ahead of them on the trail. As they got closer, they realized something was wrong. The child wore clothes from an earlier era, rough homespun fabric and hand-cobbled shoes. He seemed translucent in the forest light, becoming more or less visible depending on the angle. When they called out, the figure turned toward them, revealing a face both heartbreakingly young and impossibly old, as if decades of searching had aged the spirit beyond its years. The encounter lasted only moments before the figure began to fade, but in those brief seconds, they heard him speak one word that carried across the mountainside like an echo from the past. Mama. The word was filled with such longing and confusion that it left witnesses emotionally shaken for days. Ottie Powell may have died on Bluff Mountain more than 130 years ago, but his search for home continues, a testament to the eternal bond between a child and the family he will never stop trying to reach. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. Pierce Pond in northern Maine is 2 days of brutal hiking for one perfect fishing spot. Harold Whitmore made that journey religiously in the 1950s, obsessed with the native brook trout that grew fat and old in waters rarely touched by human presence. Whitmore was methodical about his fishing. He'd mapped every underwater structure, documented seasonal patterns, kept detailed logs of every trip. His family said he spoke about Pierce Pond with an intensity that bordered on reverence. It was the most perfect fishing water he'd ever encountered. His last trip began in September 1958. He planned 10 days alone, longer than usual, hoping to finally land the massive brook trout he'd been pursuing for years. When he failed to return, search teams found his campsite intact, tent properly erected, gear organized, supplies untouched. His fishing log had entries right up to the day before his scheduled departure, noting excellent success and anticipation for one final morning on the water. But Harold Whitmore was never found. Less than a year later, hikers reported seeing a middle-aged man fishing in the shallows, wearing vintage gear and wielding a classic bamboo fly rod. He worked the water with expert precision, casting and retrieving with the rhythm of decades of experience. When they called out, he didn't respond. When they tried to approach, he simply faded away, leaving no ripples in the water where he'd been standing. The sightings have continued for decades with remarkable consistency. Always the same figure, plaid wool shirt, canvas fishing vest, graying hair, engaged in methodical fishing behavior. Some witnesses have watched him for extended periods, noting his professional technique and the way he works different sections of the pond. The most detailed encounter occurred in 1987. Experienced angler Thomas Mackenzie spent hours observing what he thought was another fisherman on the opposite shore. But as morning progressed, he noticed disturbing details. The man never took breaks, never changed position, appeared to be fishing the exact same spot repeatedly with mechanical precision. When Mackenzie waded across to introduce himself, he got close enough to see the fisherman clearly. Vintage clothes that looked decades old, equipment from old sporting goods catalogs, and most unsettling of all, the man seemed translucent in the morning light, solid enough to cast a shadow, but not entirely present. The ghostly fisherman acknowledged Mackenzie's presence, turning with an expression of profound sadness. He spoke in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance, asking if the fish were still biting and mentioning he'd been waiting for the morning hatch to begin. When Mackenzie tried to continue the conversation, the ghost began to fade until only his voice remained, still asking about fishing conditions as it echoed across the water. Harold Whitmore's spirit appears locked in the behavior that gave his life meaning. Unlike many ghosts, who seem distressed or agitated, the Pierce Pond fisherman appears at peace, content to continue his eternal pursuit of the perfect catch. Some connections to the natural world are so powerful, they transcend death itself. For the ghostly fisherman of Pierce Pond, death wasn't an ending. It was simply a transition to a different form of the pursuit that had always given his life meaning. In eastern Kentucky, there's a figure that appears along mountain highways on humid nights when wood smoke drifts down from the ridges. Witnesses describe a man whose clothes are charred and smoking, whose skin bears fresh burns, whose eyes hold the vacant stare of someone who died in agony but refuses to accept death. This is the Scorched man, born from the tragic Miller house fire of 1983. Robert Miller died trying to save his father when their family home burned. He got his wife and 3 children out through a second-floor window, then went back inside for his elderly father. Neighbors saw him disappear into the flames, but neither man ever emerged. When investigators searched the ruins, they found the father's remains, but Robert's body was never recovered. 6 months later, trucker Danny Osborne encountered a burned man walking along Highway 80. The figure was stumbling, clothes smoking, face and hands covered with fresh burns. Osborne stopped to help, but as he got closer, he recognized the facial features. Despite the terrible damage, it looked like Robert Miller. The burned man's eyes were vacant, showing no recognition, but his mouth moved as if trying to speak. No sound emerged, but Osborne could see him mouthing the same words repeatedly. The encounter lasted minutes before the figure faded, leaving only the smell of smoke in the night air. Similar sightings accumulated over the years, and a disturbing pattern emerged. The Scorched man's appearances seemed to coincide with house fires in surrounding counties. Local firefighters began noticing that whenever he was spotted, they could expect calls about structure fires within 24 to 48 hours. The connection was so consistent that some fire departments began treating Scorched man's sightings as unofficial early warning systems. The most documented case occurred in summer 1987. Multiple witnesses saw the Scorched man on 3 consecutive nights. Over the following week, 6 house fires broke out across 3 counties, all in older homes with aging systems, all sharing characteristics with the original Miller blaze. Most chilling was the discovery that the Scorched man had been spotted walking routes that connected the fire locations, as if following a specific path between sites of past and future tragedies. The most personal encounter was reported by Sarah Miller, Robert's daughter, in 1995. She recognized her father's distinctive walk despite his burned appearance. Unlike other witnesses, the Scorched man responded to her, turning with recognition in his features. He tried desperately to communicate something important, his burned hands gesturing frantically as if warning of imminent danger. 2 days later, a fire broke out in Sarah's apartment building. Because of her encounter with her father's ghost, she'd been hypervigilant about fire safety and detected smoke early enough to evacuate the building and alert firefighters before the blaze could spread. Robert Miller died trying to save his father from fire, and his spirit continues that protective mission decades later, warning others about dangers he perceives through supernatural means. His story suggests some forms of heroism create spiritual imprints that continue their protective work even after the hero's death. What happened to Jessica Chen and Mark Rodriguez in southwestern Virginia proved that sometimes the greatest dangers in the mountains aren't natural at all. They were experienced hikers planning a week-long section through Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. Both carried proper equipment, filed itineraries with park services, and possessed wilderness experience that should have prepared them for any reasonable challenge. Nothing prepared them for what happened on July 23, 2019. Their first 3 days went perfectly. 60 miles of challenging terrain, perfect weather, spectacular views. They'd encountered other hikers regularly, sharing information and recommendations with fellow backpackers. The trail community felt friendly and supportive. On their 4th night, they camped at a dispersed site 2 miles south of Mount Rogers summit. The location offered stunning views and reliable water access, far enough from the main trail for privacy, but accessible to other hikers in emergencies. They followed proper protocols, secured food against bears, set up their tent on durable surfaces, completely extinguished their campfire before retiring. The attack began around 2 a.m. with sounds Jessica described as someone walking through the forest but trying not to be heard. They woke to branches breaking and leaves rustling in patterns that didn't match wildlife movement. Mark saw a flashlight beam moving through trees 50 yards away, sweeping back and forth as if searching. When Mark called out offering help, the light immediately disappeared and the forest fell silent. The sudden cessation was more unnerving than the original sounds. For an hour, they heard occasional sounds from different directions, footsteps, rustling leaves, the snap of twigs, as if someone was circling their campsite, studying their position. The direct attack came without warning. Around 3:30 a.m., Jessica was awakened by sharp pain in her left leg, as if struck through the tent fabric. Before she could react, another impact followed, harder and more focused, accompanied by excruciating pain that told her immediately her leg was seriously injured. Mark woke to Jessica's scream and the sound of something heavy striking the tent repeatedly. They realized they were under attack by someone wielding what felt like a baseball bat. The strikes came from multiple directions, targeting their legs and lower bodies as if trying to disable rather than kill them. Mark grabbed his headlamp and knife. When he turned on the light and unzipped the tent, he caught a glimpse of a figure in dark clothing moving away from their campsite. The attacker wore face covering and carried what looked like a wooden club, moving through the forest with unnatural ease. Jessica's leg was clearly broken, making standing impossible. Mark had sustained bruises and cuts, but less severe injuries. They realized they were extremely vulnerable. Miles from help, limited cell coverage, facing an unknown attacker who might return. Mark armed himself with knife and hatchet while helping Jessica move to a defensible position against a rock formation. This prevented anyone from approaching from behind while giving them clear views of surrounding forest. The psychological warfare that followed was almost as terrifying as the physical attack. For the remainder of the night, they could hear their attacker moving around them, sometimes close enough to hear breathing and whispered words they couldn't make out. The presence seemed to be testing their defenses, moving closer, then retreating. Most disturbing were sounds of the attacker striking trees and rocks with the same weapon, rhythmic thumping that echoed through the forest like primitive drum beats, creating an atmosphere suggesting the attack was motivated by something more than robbery or random violence. Dawn brought relief as the presence withdrew, but their ordeal continued. Miles from the nearest road, Jessica unable to hike, no cell signal. They faced an impossible situation. Around 8 a.m., they heard voices from the main trail. A group of day hikers responded to Mark's calls for help, shocked by the destroyed campsite and clear evidence of violent assault. One hiker had a satellite communicator that allowed contact with emergency services. The rescue required helicopters and specialized mountain rescue teams. The investigation revealed disturbing details and raised questions about organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas. Law enforcement found extensive evidence supporting their account. Damaged tent fabric, military-style boot prints, marks on trees matching their description of rhythmic striking sounds. Most unsettling was discovering this wasn't isolated. Similar attacks had occurred on remote trail sections over 5 years. Hikers assaulted by unknown individuals targeting legs and lower bodies, always at night in remote locations. Perpetrators with intimate trail knowledge. The pattern suggested either a skilled individual or organized group systematically targeting vulnerable hikers, using trail knowledge to select victims far from help. For Jessica and Mark, physical recovery was complicated by psychological trauma. Jessica required surgery and months of physical therapy, but both struggled with having their love of wilderness hiking transformed into fear and anxiety. Their story highlights vulnerabilities facing hikers on remote trail sections. Despite experience, proper equipment, and reasonable precautions, they were unprepared for deliberate human attack, raising questions about whether traditional wilderness safety protocols adequately address predatory humans targeting hikers. Today, they continue hiking, but never alone, always carrying satellite communicators and defensive weapons. Their experience has become part of growing awareness that the Appalachian Trail can harbor dangers beyond natural challenges most hikers prepare for. David and Maria Santos planned a romantic anniversary backpacking trip that became a 3-day nightmare of being hunted by something that moved through the forest with inhuman patience. They were experienced hikers who'd carefully selected a remote Virginia trail section for solitude and natural beauty. Both possessed wilderness skills from years of weekend adventures and outdoor education courses. Their planned route would take them through spectacular, isolated terrain, following ridge lines with panoramic views while keeping them far from crowds at more accessible destinations. The first day and a half went perfectly. They made good time, enjoyed incredible scenery, felt deep satisfaction from being self-sufficient in beautiful wilderness. The first sign of trouble came Friday evening as they set up camp in a meadow 8 miles from the nearest road. Maria noticed movement in the tree line about 100 yards away. At first she assumed it was wildlife, but the movement was too deliberate, too coordinated, too focused on their campsite for normal animal behavior. David grabbed binoculars and saw at least 3 figures positioned at different points along the tree line, motionless now that they'd been observed, but clearly watching the couple's every move. The figures were partially concealed, making details impossible to discern, but their positioning suggested coordination that was deeply unsettling. When David called out offering help, the figures immediately melted back into the forest, disappearing so quickly and quietly it seemed impossible for humans to move with such stealth through dense undergrowth. Despite the unsettling encounter, they continued with planned camping arrangements, reasoning they'd probably encountered cautious hikers. But as darkness fell, both found themselves unable to shake the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The psychological warfare began around midnight. They woke to sounds suggesting someone moving around their campsite perimeter. Unlike random wildlife noise, these sounds followed deliberate patterns, footsteps circling their tent at consistent distance, twigs snapping from multiple directions, occasional sounds resembling whispered conversations just beyond clear hearing. Most disturbing, the sounds seemed to get closer with each circuit, as if unseen visitors were gradually tightening the circle around their position. David armed himself with knife and headlamp, preparing to confront whoever was harassing them. But every time he unzipped the tent and shined light toward sound sources, the forest fell into complete silence. The sudden cessation was more unnerving than original sounds. Dawn revealed evidence their fears were justified. Around their campsite, they found multiple footprint sets in soft earth, prints clearly belonging to several individuals who'd been moving around their camp during the night. Most disturbing, some prints were within 10 feet of their tent, suggesting watchers had approached much closer than sounds indicated. The discovery forced them to confront reality. They were being deliberately stalked by multiple individuals with advanced wilderness skills and apparent malicious intentions. They decided to continue hiking, but modify their route to avoid isolated trail sections and camp only in areas offering better defensive positions. The second day revealed their stalkers hadn't been discouraged. Throughout the day, they caught occasional glimpses of figures moving parallel to their route, always staying far enough away to avoid clear identification, but close enough to make their presence known. The watchers seemed to have uncanny terrain knowledge, using ridgelines and tree cover to maintain observation while remaining largely invisible. Most unsettling, stalkers appeared to be anticipating the couple's movements, sometimes positioning themselves ahead of where David and Maria were hiking. Their second night's campsite was chosen for defensive advantages, a clearing surrounded by thick vegetation, making approach difficult, with steep rock face preventing encirclement. The second night's harassment was more intense and organized. The watchers seemed to have studied their defensive preparations and adapted tactics accordingly. Instead of simply circling, they began employing sophisticated psychological warfare techniques. Stalkers created sounds mimicking distress calls, trying to lure one or both hikers from their defensive position. They threw rocks and sticks toward the campsite from different directions, creating impressions of multiple coordinated attacks that never materialized into direct confrontation. Most disturbing was discovering stalkers were using artificial light for nighttime surveillance. David and Maria noticed brief flashes of apparent infrared illumination from forest around their campsite. Flashes visible only peripherally that disappeared when they tried to look directly. The realization that watchers possessed night vision technology transformed the situation from wilderness harassment into something suggesting military or law enforcement training. The third day brought terrifying realization their stalkers had no intention of letting them leave safely. When they broke camp and began hiking toward the trailhead, they discovered their route was being systematically blocked. Every time they tried direct paths toward civilization, they encountered evidence someone was waiting ahead. Footprints across the trail, disturbed vegetation suggesting recent human passage, and in one case, deliberately arranged rock piles sending clear messages. Their movements were monitored and controlled. They were forced to take increasingly circuitous routes as they tried evading stalkers and reaching safety. Each detour added miles and took them further into remote terrain where help would be even more difficult to reach. The climax came on the third night when they realized they were completely surrounded and escape was no longer possible through stealth or evasion. They made the decision to abandon camping gear and make desperate nighttime march toward the nearest road, using headlamps and GPS to navigate in darkness while pursuers closed in. The 6-hour forced march through treacherous terrain while being constantly harassed pushed both hikers to limits of physical and psychological endurance. The nightmare ended when they reached a Forest Service road around dawn and encountered a maintenance crew beginning daily rounds. Their appearance, disheveled, exhausted, clearly terrified, immediately convinced workers they'd experienced serious emergency. The investigation revealed disturbing details and raised troubling questions about organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas. Forest Service officers found extensive evidence supporting their account of systematic stalking. Investigators discovered multiple observation posts constructed in forest around their camping areas, posts showing signs of extended occupation and sophisticated surveillance equipment. Most chilling was discovering their experience wasn't unique. Similar incidents had occurred over 2 years involving hikers stalked and harassed in remote wilderness areas. In each case, victims described being watched and followed by multiple individuals with advanced wilderness and surveillance skills. The investigation revealed stalkers had been using military-grade equipment, night vision devices, infrared cameras, communication systems allowing coordination across large wilderness areas. The sophistication suggested the group possessed military or law enforcement training and access to equipment not readily available to civilian criminals. For David and Maria, physical recovery was complicated by lasting psychological trauma of being hunted like animals through wilderness they'd always considered refuge and renewal. Today they continue hiking, but never alone, and never in remote areas where help would be more than a few hours away. Their story has become part of growing awareness that wilderness can harbor threats far more sophisticated and organized than most outdoor enthusiasts realize. There's an unwritten rule in West Virginia's mountain hollows. If you hear your name called from the forest, especially at night, you don't answer. You don't investigate. You don't even acknowledge you heard it. This isn't superstition. It's born from generations of experience with something that lurks in the deep woods, something that's learned to perfectly mimic human voices and uses this ability to lure people away from safety into darkness where they're never seen again. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist studying black bear populations, thought this mountain wisdom was quaint folklore until she experienced it firsthand. Mitchell had relocated from urban Maryland to a remote research station in Monongahela National Forest. Her work required long hours alone in wilderness, monitoring trail cameras, collecting data, tracking radio-collared bears through isolated terrain. Her research station was a converted Forest Service cabin 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy weather. The isolation was perfect for her research, providing access to pristine bear habitat while eliminating human disturbances. The phenomenon that would shatter her security began in October when bears were actively foraging for winter hibernation. Mitchell was working late analyzing trail camera data when she heard someone calling her name from the forest outside. The voice was clear, distinct, definitely human. seeming to come from the main trail connecting her station to the nearest Forest Service road. Her first assumption was another researcher or Forest Service employee had arrived to check on her work, though it was unusual for anyone to visit after dark without arrangements. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, calling out, "Hello, who's there?" But instead of receiving an answer, she heard her name called again from a completely different direction, as if whoever was in the forest had moved several hundred yards in seconds. Thinking she might be dealing with someone lost or in distress, Mitchell called out again, offering assistance. The response was her name being called from a third location, then a fourth, as if multiple people were positioned throughout the forest around her cabin. But there was something unsettling about the calls. They all sounded like the same voice, speaking with identical intonation and cadence, as if the same person was somehow calling from multiple locations simultaneously. As Mitchell stood on her porch trying to make sense of what she was hearing, she noticed her 2 German shepherds, normally protective animals who investigated any unusual sounds, were cowering inside the cabin with their tails between their legs. Their obvious terror at something they could hear or smell in the forest sent a chill through Mitchell. The calling continued for nearly an hour, with her name being spoken from locations forming a rough circle around her cabin. The voice never got closer than about 100 yards, but also never moved farther away, as if whatever was calling was maintaining a specific distance while slowly orbiting her property. Most disturbing, the voice was beginning to sound increasingly familiar, though Mitchell couldn't place where she might have heard it before. The next morning revealed evidence her experience hadn't been hallucination. Around her cabin she found multiple footprint sets in soft earth, prints that appeared to have been made by someone walking in large circles around her property. But the prints were strange. They were human-sized and shaped, but seemed made by feet that were unnaturally wide and lacked distinct heel and toe impressions normal shoes would leave. More disturbing, some prints appeared to have claw marks at the toe end, as if whatever had been walking around her cabin possessed both human intelligence and animal physical characteristics. Despite warnings from local residents, Mitchell decided to continue her research, reasoning her work was too important to abandon based on what might be pranks or misidentified wildlife encounters. She installed motion-activated lights, upgraded security, arranged for more frequent check-ins with supervisors. But she also began keeping detailed records of unusual auditory phenomena, hoping to document whatever was responsible for the mysterious calls. The creature's tactics evolved over following weeks, demonstrating intelligence and adaptability that was deeply unsettling. Instead of simply calling Mitchell's name, the entity began using voices of people from her past. Her deceased grandmother, her ex-husband who lived in another state, even her research supervisor currently working in Alaska. Each voice was perfectly reproduced, complete with speech patterns, accents, and emotional inflections that would have been impossible for a stranger to replicate. The psychological impact of hearing familiar voices calling from darkness was devastating. Mitchell found herself torn between rational understanding that she was being manipulated and emotional response to voices that sounded exactly like people she loved and missed. The creature seemed to understand her vulnerabilities perfectly, using her grandmother's voice when Mitchell was feeling homesick and her supervisor's voice when she was struggling with difficult research aspects. The most terrifying incident occurred in November, when Mitchell was awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of her own voice calling from outside the cabin. The entity had learned to mimic her perfectly, and she could hear herself calling out for help in tones of increasing desperation and fear. The psychological horror of hearing her own voice begging for assistance while she lay terrified in bed was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, creating disorientation and fear that left her questioning her sanity. But it was the creature's interaction with technology that convinced Mitchell she was dealing with something far more dangerous than a skilled human mimic. Her trail cameras began capturing strange images of a figure that appeared human from distance but showed disturbing anomalies when viewed closely. The figure's proportions seemed wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow, head at unnatural angle on shoulders. Most disturbing were recordings from her audio monitoring equipment, which captured not only voice mimicry but also sounds that preceded and followed calls. Clicking noises resembling insect communication, low-frequency rumbles felt more than heard, and what sounded like multiple voices whispering in languages that didn't match any human speech patterns. The climax came when the creature began using her own recorded voice to call her name, playing back conversations she'd had with family members during phone calls from her cabin. The realization that the entity had been listening to and recording her private conversations was a violation that went beyond harassment into psychological warfare designed to drive her from the area or into madness. The final straw came when Mitchell's dogs began responding to the creature's calls as if they recognized the voices as legitimate. She watched in horror as her highly trained protection animals whined and scratched at the door when they heard mimicked voices of people they'd never met, but somehow seemed to recognize. Mitchell made the difficult decision to abandon her research and relocate after documenting her experiences in a detailed report submitted to wildlife authorities and paranormal research organizations. Today, Mitchell continues bear research in a different part of the country, but has never forgotten lessons learned in the West Virginia mountains. She's become an advocate for educating researchers and outdoor enthusiasts about dangers of responding to unexplained voices in remote wilderness areas. The identity and nature of the mimicking entity remains unknown, but consistency of reports across multiple states and decades suggests something with advanced vocal capabilities is actively hunting humans in remote Appalachian forests. For those who work or recreate in these areas, Mitchell's experience serves as crucial reminder that ancient wisdom of mountain communities shouldn't be dismissed as superstition. When the forest calls your name, the safest response is to ignore it completely, no matter how familiar or desperate the voice might sound. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. In the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky, family secrets run as deep as the mine shafts themselves. This is the story of a confession that came 35 years too late, revealing the terrible truth about what happened to a father who walked into an abandoned mine and never came back. The Watson family had worked coal for 4 generations. Like many mining families, they had experienced their share of tragedy. Cave-ins, explosions, black lung disease. But nothing prepared them for the mystery that began December 15, 1987, when Robert Watson left to check equipment at the abandoned Black Rock mine and simply vanished. Robert was a 42-year-old maintenance supervisor, known throughout the community as reliable and hard-working. He had a wife, Margaret, and 3 children, including 10-year-old Tommy, who idolized his father and dreamed of following him into mining. Black Rock had been closed for 5 years, but still contained valuable equipment requiring periodic monitoring. Robert's job involved checking on abandoned equipment, ensuring copper wiring and materials weren't being stolen, and monitoring structural integrity to prevent collapses affecting nearby operations. That December morning, Robert told his wife he'd be gone most of the day, planning to inventory remaining equipment and investigate reports of someone seen near the mine entrance the previous week. When Robert failed to return that evening, Margaret knew something was wrong. Mining work might keep him late, but he never failed to come home or call. She contacted the company's emergency line and learned Robert had never checked in as scheduled, and his radio had been silent since morning. The search began at dawn and quickly became one of the largest rescue operations in regional history. Mining personnel, law enforcement, fire departments, and specialized mine rescue teams all participated in the effort to locate the missing man. What they found at Black Rock was deeply unsettling. Robert's truck was parked at the mine entrance with his lunch and thermos still on the front seat. His safety gear was missing, suggesting he'd equipped himself before entering. The mine entrance showed clear signs someone had recently gone inside. Fresh footprints in dust, disturbed safety barriers, evidence of artificial lighting in the tunnels. The underground search revealed Robert had penetrated deep into the tunnel system, far beyond areas where routine maintenance would take him. Search teams followed his footprints through nearly 2 miles of abandoned tunnels and chambers, but approximately 2 miles from the entrance, in a section abandoned even before the mine's official closure, Robert Watson's trail simply ended. No signs of cave-in, no evidence of accident, no indication where he might have gone. The search continued for weeks, exploring every accessible tunnel and chamber. They found abandoned equipment, stagnant water pools, evidence of wildlife that had moved into the mine since closure. But no trace of Robert Watson beyond the point where his trail mysteriously ended. For the Watson family, Robert's disappearance created a wound that never healed. Margaret raised 3 children alone while dealing with financial hardship. The children struggled with uncertainty. Whether their father was dead or alive, whether he'd abandoned them or been victim of terrible accident. Tommy Watson grew up haunted by questions with no answers, dreams of finding his father in dark tunnels beneath the mountains. The truth remained hidden for 35 years, buried beneath layers of family loyalty, community silence, and the kind of secrets mining families keep when survival depends on not asking too many questions about what happens in darkness underground. But in 2022, as Tommy prepared for retirement after a mining career shaped by his father's disappearance, he received a phone call that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted him most of his life. The call came from his Uncle Lee, Robert's younger brother, who was dying of lung cancer and had decided some secrets were too heavy to carry to the grave. In a voice weakened by disease but strengthened by relief of finally telling the truth, Lee Watson confessed to a crime that had been eating away at his conscience for over 3 decades. The story he told was more horrifying than any theory that had circulated about Robert's disappearance, because it revealed the greatest danger in the abandoned mine hadn't been structural collapse or industrial accidents. It had been the presence of a family member willing to commit murder to protect a secret he believed was worth killing for. According to Lee's confession, Robert had discovered something during his inspection that his brother couldn't allow him to report to authorities. For months prior to Robert's disappearance, Lee had been using the abandoned mine as storage for stolen mining equipment and materials he was selling on the black market. The operation involved several other miners and had generated substantial profits, but it also represented serious federal crimes that could have resulted in lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved. When Robert discovered evidence of the theft operation during his routine inspection, Lee knew his brother's sense of duty would compel him to report the crimes to company officials and law enforcement. Lee begged Robert to keep quiet, offering him a share of profits in exchange for silence, but Robert refused to be bought or intimidated, telling his brother he had a responsibility to report what he'd found and couldn't be part of covering up criminal activity. The confrontation that followed, deep in the abandoned tunnels of Black Rock Mine, ended with Lee Watson striking his brother with a piece of mining equipment and leaving him to die in one of the mine's deepest chambers. Lee's confession included detailed directions to the location where he'd left Robert's body, information that had been tormenting him for decades as he watched his brother's family suffer with not knowing what had happened to their loved one. Following Lee's confession, Tommy contacted law enforcement and arranged for a recovery operation to retrieve his father's remains from the location his uncle described. When recovery teams reached the designated location, they found Robert Watson's remains exactly where Lee had left them 35 years earlier, along with evidence supporting every detail of his brother's confession. The recovery provided closure for a family that had spent decades wondering what happened to their patriarch, but it also opened new wounds as they struggled to process the reality that Robert had been murdered by someone they'd trusted and loved. Lee Watson died of cancer just weeks after making his confession, taking with him any possibility of legal justice for his crimes, but leaving behind a family forever chained by knowledge of what he'd done. For Tommy Watson, learning the truth about his father's death was both relief and devastating blow. The uncertainty that had defined his childhood was finally resolved, but it was replaced by knowledge that his father had died not from accident or natural disaster, but because he'd been too honest and principled to participate in his brother's criminal enterprise. Robert Watson's story teaches us that sometimes the monsters we fear in darkness aren't supernatural entities or unknown predators, but the people closest to us who are willing to do terrible things to protect their secrets. In tight-knit communities like those throughout Appalachia, family loyalty and economic desperation can create situations where criminal activity is tolerated or covered up, and where asking too many questions can be dangerous for those who discover uncomfortable truth. The lesson here is that we should trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even when it involves people we love and trust. Robert Watson's commitment to doing the right thing cost him his life, but his integrity serves as a reminder that some principles are worth maintaining, even when they come with serious personal costs. If these true Appalachian horror stories have left you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our most remote places, you're not alone. Every story I've shared tonight represents real people who faced unimaginable terror in the mountains they thought they knew. But here's what haunts me most. For every story I've told you, there are dozens more that remain untold, buried in police files, family secrets, and the collective memory of mountain communities who know better than to speak of certain things out loud. Subscribe to Verified Fears right now and hit that notification bell, because the darkness in the Appalachian Mountains runs deeper than any of us realize, and these stories are just the beginning. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that some places demand respect, some voices should never be answered, and some family secrets are too dangerous to keep silent. The mountains are listening, and they remember everything.